How's it going?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me once again tonight. I have Dot asleep on my foot, so she might wake up at any moment and start barking and disturb this whole enterprise, kind of like she did last night. But hopefully, at least tonight, we won't have the sound issues that we had last night. Tonight, we have some really scandalous news. Tucker Carlson is a font of scandals who just never stops. So we're going to read a text message that he sent to one of his producers that was actually brought to discovery under the Dominion lawsuit that was technically supposed to be protected by some of the law surrounding privacy about some of these court proceedings. So I'm really curious what happened there, who released this, and whether they'll get into any trouble over it. Probably not, since I know that they plan to go after Tucker Carlson for everything they're worth, and it doesn't surprise me at all that they're taking this tack. We're going to read what he says. I want you guys to make the judgment about whether or not he was right or wrong, because he said one thing, 6 words, the shortest point he's ever made. He would probably tell you, because he talks constantly about how he talks too much. And the left cannot let it go. But before we get started tonight, like, share, and subscribe, or else you run the risk of waking Dot up and she is asleep on my foot. It's the cutest thing you could possibly imagine. I just can't take a picture of it because it's a very awkward angle. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that she can continue her little nap during our show tonight. Hello, Whisper. Thank you for joining. Andy has tweeted. We will take a look at that tweet in just a second. In fact, let me pull that up. And then we're going to look at a poll that I just conducted. People have been telling me that Anheuser-Busch just needs to apologize for what they did. So I took a little poll and I said, what do you think? It's very similar to the poll that I have pinned here. Oh, that's at the top of the chat here, asking questions about how if you used to buy Bud Light. I clarified in this poll that I wanted to ask people who used to buy Bud Light, if they apologized, would it fix things after what happened at the beginning of April? And just like in my Twitter poll, most people are kind of saying, no, it's too late, or no, I see who they are now, which is a really interesting response. Go ahead and participate in that poll. I want to see what you guys are thinking here on YouTube, just like I found out on Twitter as well. Here we are on Twitter. Andy says, Trad Queen Story Hour with Sour Patch Lids is live right now, all caps, thank you dear. Tonight, as an AI languaging model, I cannot write a tweet about racist Tucker text message, question mark, emojis, wonderful. Thank you very much, dear. Andy is my entire marketing department, and he's really pretty good at it, so make sure that you retweet him and go over to Twitter. And check out this poll that I set up earlier today. If Anheuser-Busch apologized, would you buy their products again? I got a lot of responses saying, I never bought them in the first place, completely understand. I never did either. In fact, I kept talking about how I would never buy from them in the first place, so I'm not able to participate in the boycott. Andy says in the chat, I will never drink Bud Light again. He will not. Andy is fully dry. He drank all of his lifetime allotment of alcohol very early in his life. If Anheuser-Busch apologized, would you buy their products again? 2.3% of people said yes, immediately, love them. 8.9% said yes, very skeptically. So between those two yeses, we have about 11%. And then we have no, it took too long. Almost 20% of people said that. And then finally, winning in a landslide is no, I see who they are now, which I thought was really interesting. I said additional observation. Everyone forgot/didn't care that they make awful weak beer, but now that they remember, they can just resolve to not buy it ever again like they already weren't, which is exactly where I am. President Dr. Rollergator, MVIP, PhD, says, again, what? As in, like, I would not buy them again because I'm not buying them in the first place. I said, this assumes people bought it in the first place. Someone was buying it, Gator. It was number one. Bud Light was number one, and it's apparent that they might actually slip from that position. Some of the other feedback said, based off this poll, it's clear they probably won't apologize now. The math doesn't work for them, and I'm inclined to agree. It doesn't matter what they do at this point. They can apologize to the right, and the left will come after them, or they can apologize to the left and the right will come after them, like we talked about yesterday. The Human Rights Campaign is hounding them to stick by trans influencers, and I don't know which way they're going to go. Really curious. I think they probably really regret their choice to use a particular activist to promote this in the first place. Everybody's saying I wasn't a Bud consumer as it is. It has to be clear and address what people took offense with. This means they need to understand it fully, which I doubt they do. My occasional Budweiser buys ended March 31st. The day of this campaign started April 1st. I at first thought it actually was an April Fool's joke. I can't have been alone in that, right? I can't have been the only person who saw this activist promoting Bud Light of all brands. And I was like, that has to be a joke, right? It wasn't. It was horrifying, and it's all downhill from there. Thank you, Unheil Snipes, for retweeting. Randy says, I don't drink. Neither does Andy. That's why it's funny. Unheil says, I wouldn't switch back to Busch if you paid me. Coors Light is so much better. Oh, goodness gracious. Just all terrible beers in general. I used to really enjoy some of the foreign beers. There was one that actually came, I think, from a monastery in, I want to say, Denmark. It was called Grimbergen, and I loved it. When I first tried it, to me, it tasted like Starburst, and I didn't realize at the time that it was something like 9% ABV, and I was shocked. So I was like, it's such great things in such a small package. Tastes amazing and high alcohol content. For me, that was everything I was looking for. Really enjoyed that. Haven't had that in a really long time. I'm not even sure you can find that in the US, but doesn't matter. We are a very dry, very sober crowd over here. We have other things to think about. Oh, here's a good idea. They need to make a commercial saying there are only two genders featuring Matt Walsh. I liked that one. Interesting. Other, no, their beer is ish, and I already wasn't drinking any before. Correct. It's the worst beer you could possibly hope to find in this world. No one should be buying their products, not because of their business policies, but because it's just actually really bad. That would be the free market telling them that they do not have a good product. Unfortunately, that was not the message that they were getting. They were getting the message that people really love Bud Light, and so they were pushing forward with these crazy ideas. Someone just posted this gif of Trump, and I have to say, Trump Jr. was the one who was saying that we shouldn't boycott. I'm just saying, I'm not going to go any further with that, but I don't think Donald Trump would be okay with the boycott. To be honest, I seldom bought their products before. My wife kind of likes that shock top stuff when we go out. I'll just buy her I forget how this is pronounced. It's like the the German equivalent. It's like a shandy instead. Good idea. Never bought them to begin with and will continue not buying. Great strategy. I don't drink at all. Easiest boycott ever. Yes, for sure. Somebody did point out, and I just actually moved away from it, unfortunately. If I did drink it, yes. Here's the thing. When the company makes a misstep and you stop buying their product, it's a message. When they attempt to address the issue, start patronizing them again, because it's also a message to them. Negative and positive reinforcement. However, as we were just talking about, the free market should indicate that a bad beer should not get a positive reception from the free market. So I don't know. Either way with that, I feel like this is too late. I feel like we see them as they are now. Somebody mentioned ESGs. That's a little bit advanced. I feel like most people don't fully understand ESGs or what they mean. So probably not the best way to make that case or argument, but in either case, people tend to agree that an apology actually wouldn't fix the issue here. And yeah, I kind of agree. Everybody just kept saying to me, oh, all they have to do is apologize. I'm like, no, I don't think that's going to fix it. But I just thought that was super interesting. Wanted to share that with you guys. And that's an interesting start to tonight's conversation. So we're going to talk about that scandalous text message from Tucker Carlson. And I want you guys' opinion. I personally found it to be incredibly inspiring, and not because I'm a racist, but because of what Tucker said after the supposedly racist 6 words that scared the left so badly. New York Times, this is the text that led to Tucker Carlson's firing from Fox News. First of all, yes, the New York Times did go out of their way to assume that Fox News fired Tucker Carlson because of this text message. I don't believe that's the case at all. This is from 2021, okay? January 7th. That's not really necessary to this conversation. Germane, which is a word that I'm constantly wanting to use but always miss my opportunity, not really germane to this conversation. It happened on January 7th, the day after January 6th, if you can recall anything that happened on that day. The New York Times thinks that this is what caused Tucker to be fired. Let's see exactly how scandalous this is. The New York Times claimed Tuesday night that it knows the exact text popular host Tucker Carlson sent that led to his firing from Fox News and his highly rated program. Tucker Carlson tonight, the outlet is alleging that a missive sent to a producer was inflammatory and set off a panic at the highest level of Fox on the eve of its billion-dollar defamation trial against Dominion voting systems. We will not talk about why they were in a case against they were having a case brought against them by Dominion. Fox settled this suit on the 11th in an 11th hour deal for $787.5 million, that is over $500 million, rather than risk a trial and the exposure of more damaging information during the discovery process. The discovery of the message contributed to a chain of events that ultimately led to Mr. Carlson's firing, the Times writes. Here is the message that the newspaper says they obtained. I put in line breaks for clarity. Yes, Tucker wrote blocks of text. Really interesting. People were asking who writes like this. Andy and I do. Anybody who's very verbally acute tends to write like this. Yes, even in text messages. Just because it's not the way you write text messages doesn't mean that nobody does. This is a very interesting story that he's about to relate. See if you can catch the issue. A couple of weeks ago, I was watching video of people fighting on the street in Washington. A group of Trump guys surrounded an Antifa kid and started pounding the living ish out of him. It was 3 against 1, at least. Jumping a guy like that is dishonorable, obviously. You can almost hear Tucker saying this. It's not how white men fight. Yet suddenly I found myself rooting for the mob against the man, hoping they'd hit him harder and kill him. I really wanted them to hurt the kid. I could taste it. Then somewhere deep in my brain, an alarm bell went off. This isn't good for me. I'm becoming something I don't want to be. The Antifa creep is a human being. Much as I despise what he says and does, much as I'm sure I'd hate him personally if I knew him, I shouldn't glow over his suffering. I should be bothered by it. I should remember that somewhere somebody probably loves this kid and would be crushed if he was killed. If I don't care about those things, if I reduce people to their politics, how am I better than he is? That's the end of what Tucker Carlson says. Can you guys see what the left is seizing on? A very, very interesting thing. The only thing they notice from all that text is just 6 words long. And that is, you guessed it, it's not how white men fight. Okay, interesting statement. When I first read it to Andy, he was like, that does sound a little bit racist. You guys tell me if you think it was at all. But when is the last time you saw a team of white guys mob attacking anyone. I'll wait. Seriously. Because I personally can't recall the last time I saw this caught on video, but you can see the opposite. And Matt Walsh had some very inflammatory commentary on this earlier today. He said, this is the crime of noticing the way things work. I don't know. I don't pretend to know. I'm not going to read you statistics. We're not getting into any of that nonsense. I'm just saying that I don't think Tucker Carlson said that in order to be racist. He pointed out that it wasn't honorable, and this is not something that we do. I really can't argue with it. I haven't seen anything to prove him wrong. But what he goes on to say, they are intentionally ignoring because if they give it any attention, they will have to be nuanced. And I am convinced that they don't ever themselves stop and question their own motivations like Tucker did here. He's interrogating himself in a way that I am convinced that the left does not. And I don't think that's because they're NPCs. I think that's because they're out of practice. No one is forcing them to interrogate themselves because everyone around them is fully on board with exactly what they think about the world, okay? I actually wrote about this. I said that being a conservative is good for your brain because you are not surrounded by people who agree with you. You aren't surrounded by people who see the world the way you do. In fact, you're constantly having to defend your point of view from other people who fully disagree with you. I think that's good. I think that's good for you. And that rolls right into my thesis that people need conflict and they need difficulty to sharpen themselves and to maintain excellence. And this is why hard times create strong men, right? So all of my ideas kind of pile into this one idea that you have to have some kind of pushback on your ideas. You have to have some kind of, I don't know, like feedback. You have to have some negative feedback. You have to hear the negative in order to polish the positive in your own viewpoints. And I feel this constantly. I feel like I'm constantly discarding parts of my viewpoints that aren't correct because I keep hearing them being disproven. And I think that's great. But that never, ever happens on the left. And this is why you get people like Stephen King. Let me see if I can pull this up real fast. I'm going to have to go take a walk down Lydia's feed. Let's see here. Stephen King, who writes thousands and thousands and thousands of words, and yes, including orgies that involve underage people, would just like to point that out. I said, famous author can't read more than 6 words. I highlighted the offending part and then the part where Tucker redeemed himself fully. And Stephen King said, Tucker Carlson, this isn't how white men fight. Despicable. First of all, I sincerely, deeply, from the bottom of my heart, with every fiber of my being, object to the way Stephen King writes his tweets. What is happening with the space key on his keyboard? Why are there 2 spaces between every single word he writes? Holy cow. Anyway, John Hawkins says, this isn't how white men fight. It's supposed to be one-on-one. Interesting observation. Not really racialized. And I said, why don't you give full context, Stevie? Because it ruins your narrative. And I'm being intentionally condescending because Stephen King refuses to give full context. And I don't believe in giving these people more grace than they would offer you. So I said, here is the full context. There you go. There you go. Jim Treacher says, you should space out your words more. Thank you, Jim. I fully agree. And I added then, because I really want to ratio Stephen King on this, call me immature. I said Tucker goes on to reflect on and reject his bad impulse. I can tell you've never done the same, but you should try it. It's very good for you as a person. Sean goes on, it's actually commenting on your fiction and misspoke, meant to say this isn't how white men write. I don't know what he means by that. Somebody has already blocked me in the comments. Very interesting. He's not wrong. You absolute goat fart. Yeah, I mean, honestly. Yeah, what is despicable about this statement? I can't see it myself. Let me refresh the chat because it seems to be frozen. Oh, here we go. Lori adds, Stephen King is a lunatic. I don't know if he's a lunatic. I feel like he's probably a combination of misled and also full of vendettas. He strikes me as someone who's very angry. And that's the other thing, too, I will add before we judge lefties too harshly. I feel like all of the people who are critiquing people in this way that Stephen King does, I've seen it in my own personal life. The people who are the most vitriolic and the people who lash out the hardest are always the angriest, and underneath anger is sadness. That is just the way it is, unfortunately. And that means if we are going to exercise our Tucker skills, we do need to be a little bit compassionate, because these people who are screaming at us at the end of the day aren't even necessarily angry at us. They're ideologically possessed, for one thing, and underneath that, when they're motivated by anger, is also a deep layer of sadness. And I think that that's something that we could bear keeping in mind. I certainly could. I certainly yell at people sometimes on Twitter in a way that I probably shouldn't. I should probably be a little bit more compassionate. If we are going to mend some of these divides in our country, we do need to keep in mind that the people who are yelling are hurt. Hurt people hurt people. I know you've heard that line. It's a bit of a trite saying, but I think it's true. Two Ladies Midwest Adventures, thank you for commenting. Full context is very important always. True and correct. Signed off. Co-signed, I will say. Some rando says racist and accurate have a lot of overlap. I don't know if that's always the case, but my English teacher, who was not a right-leaning lady, back when I was in high school in junior year or senior year, mentioned that every stereotype has a root in reality. And that was interesting, because I know that she would consider herself super anti-racist now. In fact, I should probably check up on her and see where she's at as far as this left-leaning stuff goes. Maybe she was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. I'm moving away from this stuff. Who knows? Don't really know. For somebody who really, truly, genuinely grasps that each stereotype has roots in reality, and I will say this as a woman, all the stereotypes about us are rooted in reality. The other part to keep in mind, this is something Andy would really want to drive home, is that you can't just be tribal, okay? You can't just look at a group and assign a stereotype classification to them. You need to look at each person and decide based on their own actions. This is what Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to point out. You need to understand their perspective, their point of view, their character, and you need to view them as a fellow human being, not just a member of a group. I forget what Andy calls that. It's such a simple word. I have such a hard time with the simplest words. I swear, it's really irritating. But let's go on with his article about Tucker's tweet, or his message that's so inflammatory. It should be noted that the contents of this message are apparently subject to a court order, and whoever disclosed it to the Times may have violated that court order in doing so. Interesting note. Do you think anyone will get in trouble over this? I don't either. If the Times is to be believed, it was the phrase, "It's not how white men fight," that apparently sent Fox brass into panic mode. They had already known about other texts he'd sent saying, "I hate him," Trump, passionately, and calling a senior Fox News executive the C word. Oh my, spicy feelings. The text came out during the discovery phase of Dominion's lawsuit, which alleged that Fox outlets aired claims about the election. Right. We know this. But the discovery of the new text was different in their minds. The text alarmed the Fox board, which saw the messages a day before Fox was set to defend itself against Dominion voting systems before a jury. The board grew concerned that the message could become public at a trial when Mr. Carlson was on the stand, creating a sensational and damaging moment that would raise broader questions about the company, but it didn't. And I wonder then if the New York Times is postulating that the reason that Fox settled for such a massive amount of money with Dominion was partly because of this text message, but I don't think that would be correct. I think that's crazy. Whether or not the text would ultimately have been admissible in trial is unclear. Still, they hired an outside law firm to look into the matter, and then not long after, Tucker was gone. I found his text to be an interesting example of soul-searching and understanding that we all have to appeal to our better nature. He recognized that he was having inappropriate feelings about the assault on an Antifa member, and he realized that's not who he wanted to be. That is honorable, I'm sorry, at the end of the day. But he had already hit the third rail of commentary, race. The New York Times went on to cherry pick in their article, attempting to paint Carlson as a white supremacist. Nonsense. If you know the first thing about Tucker Carlson, nothing could be further from the truth. Carlson's text doesn't spew hate and doesn't denigrate any racial group, but we know that his detractors will do everything in their power to portray it in the worst possible light. Fox News evidently wasn't willing to defend him on this one. If the Times is right, and that's always open to question since they're incredibly biased and often get things like the Russia collusion narrative wrong, it's too bad that one text that was supposed to be private was the final nail in the coffin for a 6-year run of riveting television. Carlson's departure from Fox News has sent shockwaves through the news industry, then they go on to talk about becoming part of their VIP crowd. And I do think it's super important to support conservative media because they are doing things that CNN and Fox won't do. Andy says collectivism. Thank you. Again, the simplest words that I just can't find when the time comes. We do not want to be collectivists. That's dumb, it's simplistic, and it's the easy way out. View people as individuals, or GTFO, as Andy would likely say. Two Ladies Midwest Adventures says, be back shortly. I have to make a quick video for my daughter and her channel out here. Much love if I am not able to make it back in time. Thank you again for joining us. Appreciate that. Zach says, no more gas stoves. Woohoo. That is an interesting transition. Let's see how everybody else feels about that. So guys, remember when they were telling us that they weren't actually going to ban gas stoves? Well, first they said they might, and then they said they would, and then they said they wouldn't. And NPR was like, you guys are crazy. This is right-wing lunacy. We're about to unpack all of that stuff because New York is banning the implementation of gas stoves in new buildings going forward. Gas stove bans promoted from baseless conspiracy theory to New York state policy. According to Reason, the Libertarian magazine, New York's budget deal includes a ban on gas stoves in new residential construction. The government actually is coming for your gas stove. New York's new state budget includes a provision banning gas stoves in new residential construction. CNN reports that only electric stoves will be allowed in buildings under 7 stories by 2026 and taller buildings by 2029. The policy is the latest successful attack on an appliance used and cherished by millions of Americans. Berkeley, California was the first city to ban gas stoves in new buildings in 2019. A handful of other California cities have since followed suit. New York City adopted a local level ban at the end of 2021. It goes into effect next year for smaller buildings. Those are pretty blue places, with populations generally taking the new bans with grace and good humor. When Consumer Report Safety Commission member Richard Trumka Jr. suggested this ban could be adopted nationwide, gas stove owners everywhere flipped out. In response to the backlash, Senator Chuck Schumer assured everyone that government gas grabbing was a MAGA conspiracy theory, right? Remember that? They were telling us that we were all crazy. We're about to look at an NPR article that says exactly that. And yes, Schumer said the same thing. Mainstream media fact checkers said much the same thing. In the senator's state, at least the conspiracists did have something to worry about. Supporters of gas stove bans argued that the gas needed to fuel them is bad for the climate, and the emissions they produce within the home are bad for your health. Specifically children. Won't someone think of the children? That is always the question whenever they push more big government expansion. It's never a good thing. They don't actually care about the kids. If they did, they wouldn't be pro-abortion, but I digress. In the short term, mandated electrification of appliances is probably worse for the climate. On-site use of gas stoves and furnaces uses almost all the energy in the gas. Generating electricity from gas and then using that electricity to power appliances, it's much less efficient. Of New York's 10 largest power plants, for instance, 5 are powered by natural gas. Interesting. Another reason to oppose gas stove bans is that people like their gas stoves. Yeah, and people should be free to choose what kind of stove they use. I'm sorry. At the end of the day, I think that more freedom is probably better. Most home chefs and pretty much all professional chefs will tell you that electric stoves take a long time to heat up and are far less responsive when changing heat levels. Induction stoves, while they are actually quite fast to heat up, require different types of cookware and kitchen thermometers in addition to being a lot more expensive than electric stoves, wrote Reason's Liz Wolfe earlier this year. Despite spreading bans, there is some hope for gas stove enthusiasts. Trumka's comments saw Republicans and Democrats in Congress propose legislation to protect the appliances from a federal ban. We'll see what happens with that. But I would like to point you guys in the direction of NPR saying the facts and strategy behind the outrage over rumors of a ban on gas stoves. This is from January of this year. The conservative media was in an uproar last week over speculation that the federal government planned to ban gas cooking stoves and possibly seize them. It escalated into something much larger online. Okay, so here they have a clip from Hannity that said, but now not only is Biden coming for your paycheck, he's also coming for your stove. You heard me right. The White House is now attempting to ban all gas ovens and burners. This is how fact checkers get away with it. Hannity was wrong. This is not a federal government plan. Yet. Not yet. Not yet. And that's why Chuck Schumer felt safe saying that no bans were coming down the pike on the federal level. Technically correct, as we know from Futurama, the best kind of correct, let's be fair. But if states are starting to ban gas stoves, I'm pretty sure that this will go to the federal level, but we will see what happens with that. I just thought it was really, really funny. Here we also have from CNN saying a U.S. federal agency is considering a ban on gas stoves, also earlier this year. kind of proving NPR wrong. Oh, by the way, NPR is in the news when it comes to Elon Musk as well. Kind of fun and interesting. CNN is not right-wing media, okay? Let's be fair. CNN is as pretty much as left as they can get, even though they are, in fact, collaborating with Donald Trump over the course of the next week. But there are also 7 states banning new gas-powered cars. They are also taking a page out of California's book. A growing number of states are following California's lead and mandating zero-emission vehicles. More than half a dozen states are slated to join California in prohibiting the sale of new gasoline-powered cars by 2035. And as you guessed it, these states are blue states. So let's see if they have the list here. Kind of interesting. California will require all new cars, SUVs, and pickup trucks sold in the state to generate zero tailpipe emissions by 2035. Approved by the California Air Resources Board, CARB boards. In August, the policy won't take existing gas-powered cars off the road, but automakers and car dealers will be restricted to selling electric vehicles and certain plug-in hybrids. Again, I have to ask, where do these people think the electricity comes from? The electricity for their green cars? Does it just come from unicorn farts? Does it come out of thin air? Absolutely not. It is produced the same way that electricity has always been produced, by using coal power to fuel the power plants. You know what I mean? The electricity plants, whatever. It's still coming from coal, and they don't seem to care because it's all about the virtue signal. The other thing too that people don't seem to care about is where these car parts come from, about the lithium mining, about how many of the parts of these cars are coming directly from China. They don't care because they don't care about the future of the US. They only care about this virtue signal. And this makes me feel like it can't last, right? So the lists include, 17 states follow California's rules, but so far only Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, and Washington have announced they will enforce the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule and prohibit the sale of new gas-powered vehicles. In November, the Vermont legislature approved changes to clean car requirements that would require new cars sold in the state to be zero-emission vehicles by 2030. WCEX reported. It's not clear, however, if the rule change has been approved by Secretary of State Sarah Copeland-Hanses. I'm sure it will be, because it's Vermont. Colorado has adopted California's zero-emission policies in the past, but Governor Jared Polis has rejected the idea of a ban. Instead, his administration has said the state agencies will focus on making electric vehicles more affordable and practical. And I have to stop here and give Colorado a teensy modicum of credit, because Jared Polis actively chose during the course of his campaign for governor to not disclose that he was, in fact, gay. None of my coworkers knew it when he was elected and his partner went up on stage to accept, for a victory speech or whatever. They were like, "Did you know that he was gay?" And everyone was like, "No, I had no idea." To me, that is much more honorable than someone who rides to success, like, for example, the Massachusetts governor, Maura Healey, by saying, for example, "I am a lesbian, look at me roar, I'm so successful," shattering the glass ceiling, doing all this LGBTQIAA plus stuff. No, I infinitely prefer a more moderate Democrat like Jared Polis over someone who's willing to use their identity to win an election. I don't like that. Some rando says, "California, we only want electric vehicles." Also, California, "Our grid is overloaded. Please don't charge your cars." That's right. California asked people not to charge their cars. Let's look this up. I saw a fact check on this and I was like, that's not right. California asks electric I spelled that wrong. Doesn't matter. Owners not to charge cars. Let's see here. Amid heat wave, California asks electric vehicle owners, what's the rest of this headline, to limit charging. Critics of the state's push to end reliance on gas-powered vehicles seized on the news. But is it true or is it not, New York Times? Is it true? Okay, then shut up. Because people are just pointing out how insane it is that a state that is requiring people to buy electric vehicles is simultaneously telling them that they literally can't charge their cars. Let's hear the New York Times out, just because that's what we do over here. We're very compassionate. But environmentalists, oh good, I do love hearing from environmentalists, said the extreme weather underscored the need for the EV transition. Okay, so it's true that California is saying don't charge your car, but environmentalists are pointing out that our use of normal cars is actually what's changing the weather. which is what they're blaming for California's ridiculous infrastructure failures. I don't think that's fully fair. I know that there are some weather-related issues with California's grid. I think that's probably also the case in Texas, where it gets super hot and their grid gets overloaded as well. Pretty sure that you can't actually blame global warming for all of the problems in California, although that is exactly what environmentalists are trying to do. That is a very weak and shaky argument, and the people seizing on this problem are not really seizing on it because the argument in opposition to it is so weak. California asked residents not to charge electric vehicles. That's right. Charging cars at home at night is also apparently not the right way to go. Oh, that's irritating. So there's no time of day that you can do it. And also there's so little electricity in California that you probably just shouldn't do it at all during peak hours. Okay, so not at night and not during peak hours. When can you do it? Is there any time when you could actually charge your electric vehicle that wouldn't cause problems for California's grid? Doesn't seem like it to me, but I don't live in California. Who am I to know? All right, Two Ladies Midwest Adventures says we are back now. Made it. Very good. Happy to have you back. Just ranting about California like we do. Talking about these states is super depressing, but thankfully, super depressing. I don't typically shorten my endings like that. Super depressing. Fortunately, we have some red states to keep us happy. Let's look, for example, at what California has been up to. Legislature passes Governor Ron DeSantis' backed ban on central bank digital currency with Democratic support. So this is kind of bipartisan. Interesting. Quote, with this bill, we are looking to protect the privacy of Floridians, which I guess is the name for people who live in Florida. Democrats in the legislature have fought against most of Governor Ron DeSantis' proposals this regular session, but most of them supported a measure to ban central bank digital currencies in Florida. The House passed Senate Bill 7054 by a 116-1 vote, with Rep. Felicia Robinson of Miami Gardens Democrat casting the lone no vote. The Senate approved the measure 34-5 last week, with 7 out of the 12 Democrats that in the chamber supporting it as well. The bill defines a CBDC as a digital medium of exchange or digital monetary unit of account issued by the U.S. Federal Reserve System, a federal agency, a foreign government, a foreign central bank, or a foreign reserve system, and prohibits the acceptance of such currency by the state. Very interesting. DeSantis pushed for the measure, raising the specter of a federal government being able to track purchases or impose sanctions on people who buy firearms. Very valid points. Chief Financial Officer Jimmy Patronis also backed the bill. That's a really amusing last name if you're familiar with Harry Potter. The last thing that our country needs is a federally controlled centralized bank digital currency weaponized by the Biden administration, he said in a released statement. It's just another way for Floridians to have their vital financial information surveilled by the government. That's true, but they already have all of the tax information, which includes literally how we spend every single dollar that we make. Ridiculous. California won't let it stand. No one asked for this. President Biden last year issued an executive order calling for the study of the use of a CBDC as a way to protect consumers using decentralized cryptocurrencies and crack down on financial crimes. Well, if Joe Biden just wants to protect people and crack down on financial crimes, who are we to say no to that? That sounds truly honorable, doesn't it? Yeah, absolutely not. I don't trust anything the government in general does, but especially not the Biden administration. Absolutely wild that he even floated this. With this bill, we are looking to protect the privacy of Floridians, and I am so proud that we have seen support from leadership in our state that clearly cares about the well-being of our citizens, said Representative Wyman Duggan, a Jacksonville Republican. That's fantastic. Well, the IMF has wonderful glowing things to say about CBDCs or whatever they're called, which I don't really even want to read. We don't love the International Monetary Fund, and I feel like this article pretty well broke down what a CBDC, yes, I pronounced it right, is as far as how it would work in terms of surveillance and all that other stuff. I did post a meme to Instagram that got fact checked because it said something along the lines, here's what here's what happens when you have a CBDC. Everything's tracked, literally everything. You can't, it's talking about going cashless, okay? And this would be one of the things that having a CBDC would promote. They don't want you to use cash. That means literally everything would be tracked literally all the time. And like they're saying in this article, if you decide to buy a gun, that will be 100% tracked. And they're not even talking about black market stuff. They're talking about giving your kids allowances and just buying like lemonade on the street corner and stuff that involves literally children and like paltry cents and dollars. All of it would be tracked. All of it would be subject to governmental oversight. And I personally don't have time for that. But what else has Florida been up to? My goodness, other good stuff. It's such a breath of fresh air, honestly, when you read about Florida lately. Florida Senate okays expansion of parental rights measure, sending bill to DeSantis' desk. Let's see exactly what this entails. The original Parental Rights and Education Law, aka the Don't Say Gay bill, no one even knows what it's called because the media in general has just referred to it as that instead of using its actual title, which is and remains the Parental Rights and Education Law. Drew criticism from LGBT advocates and major corporations within the state, like Disney, who maligned it as a, quote, don't say gay bill, right? Like I just said. The Florida Senate on Wednesday approved an expansion of the state's parental rights and education law, barring classroom instruction on gender identity or sexual orientation through the 8th grade. Fantastic, because I don't know if you guys recall this, but all the hullabaloo over the don't say gay bill was somewhat hampered by the fact that it only went up to the 3rd grade. And everyone was like, are you kidding? That's nothing. You just have to wait. Conservatives were calling it the wait till 8 bill. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty much all that's doing. It's just forestalling it by a little bit. Pushing it up to the 8th grade will be really helpful. The state's upper chamber approved the plan in a 27-12 vote. So those 12 we just learned from that last article would have been all of the Democrats, which is very interesting. While there was a little bit of bipartisan overlap when it came to the CBDCs, there is none when it came to actual parental rights and education. Good to know, even in Florida. The state house previously approved the plan in a late March 77-35 vote, and it's now headed to Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis' desk for signature. I'm sure he will sign it. At present, this law bars discussion of gender identity or sexual orientation through the 3rd grade. The new measure would expand that restriction through the 8th grade, while also imposing limitations on the use of preferred pronouns should they not correspond with one's biological sex. Very interesting. It shall be the policy of every public K-12 educational institution that is provided or authorized by the Constitution and laws of Florida that a person's sex is an immutable biological trait and that it is false to ascribe to a person a pronoun that does not correspond to such person's sex, according to the bill. An employee, contractor, student of a public K-12 educational institution may not be required, as a condition of employment or enrollment or participation in any program, to refer to another person using that person's preferred personal title or pronouns if such personal title or pronouns do not correspond to that person's sex. The original Parental Rights and Education Law drew criticism from LGBT advocates and major corporations within the state, like Disney. Right, we went over this already. So I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but there are actually a couple different teachers in California who are currently suing the state because they were told in no uncertain terms, and one of them was actually punished for questioning this policy, that they had to hide social gender transitions from parents. They were required to by law. So I don't know if you're familiar with the California law around this, but they call it some kind of gender equality thing. It's not a big deal. But you guys know, based on your understanding of the First Amendment, that you cannot compel someone's speech in violation of their religious principles. And the teachers who are talking about this are Catholic teachers. And they certainly have a case, and I'm really optimistic that that sets a precedent, yes, even in California. And Florida is looking at California and saying, holy cow, this is a terrible idea. We cannot allow this to happen. Really glad they're doing this. And I've said it before and I will say it again. If you are taking money from the state, and this is something that school choice people have brought up as well, and I think they have a good point here. If you take money from a government establishment, if you take money from that institution, you're going to be enthralled to what they say. You're going to have to obey them or you will lose that funding. And if you made it so that your whole operation is dependent on that funding, you go against that institution, you lose your entire operation. And that's not something people want. So you need to consider that when you look at funding from a source that's not you, right? If you're not funding it yourself or it's not charitably contributed to you, then you need to understand that your chains can be yanked by somebody else. And that's not something that you want. It's part of the reason that Timcast didn't want investors and they didn't want a board or anything like that. Completely understand. Like, this is what we saw a little bit with James O'Keefe at Project Veritas, people telling you what to do, how to do it. And that I will say extends even past money. It extends to what you cover and how you cover it. Although in the case of James O'Keefe, there was definitely money involved as well. But on the topic of schools and education, I just wanted to point out something that I think we all already know from Politico. National test scores show a decline in history and civics proficiency. I mean, of course it does. Of course, because it's so clear to me, especially at this point, that we've completely forgotten what history was like. So we complain an awful lot, right? I mean, an awful lot about really, really, really small complaints. All of this fixation on pronouns, all of this focus on self, all of this attention to identity just proves 100% without a doubt how easy our lives are and how cushy everything is. We don't actually have real challenges. And you know what would remedy some of that would be a full and thorough understanding of history. I'm talking Genghis Khan. I'm talking the conquests of a bunch of different countries. I'm talking about how the Slavs were some of the most enslaved people on earth, and they were not even of, melanated races. And this is something that we need to teach people, but we are not willing to do because that undermines the ideologies that the left wants to understand. We know the left has captured the institutions and they are never going to let go of it. So that's never going to happen. But this loss of history and civics knowledge is the natural outcome of that capture. Knowledge of civics among the nation's 8th graders fell for the first time since the federal government began testing children under the current framework in 1998. I'm willing to bet that this is because of DEI. And I wasn't able to find anything to back this up. Just my theory. Willing to bet that we are not teaching children actual history because history, according to many public school teachers, is racist, right? Like, we can't teach about anything good that people have done because sometimes that carries a racial overtone and we can't talk about any of that stuff and the way things used to be. So why would we teach history? As far as civics goes, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the idea that if they don't even tell you about the rights you have, it makes it much easier for them to take them away from you. 100%. And I think that's entirely the reasoning behind not teaching kids civics. Kids need to know what their rights are. They need to know what they're entitled to, because as human beings in the United States, we have reached a conclusion that human beings, by dint of being created in God's image, they have rights from God, not from the government, but from God, that the government has no right interfering with. The right to defend yourself, the right to speak your thoughts freely, the right to associate with the people you want to associate with. Such simple, basic rights from God, from a higher power given to us that exist far outside of any form of government, should never be interfered with by the government. That's why those concepts exist in the Constitution. When you don't even teach those ideas, how would kids know that? How would they even know they have a right to free speech? They're just going to listen to what their teachers tell them and go according to that. Keenan says CDBC, CDBC, CD Bitcoin. There you go. That's the secret. What can I say? Civics seems to have disappeared too, it seems, for sure, and I just ranted about that for sure. Poor performance. Results from exams administered in the spring of 2022 offer a window into the state of academic performance in social studies following pandemic disruptions to learning. Of course, they're blaming the pandemic. I am continuing to blame DEI. That's the only rational explanation for this. I don't think you can blame the pandemic for this. And we actually can't blame the actual pandemic for this. And this has been another thing that's really been irritating me about this. You can't blame the pandemic for what happened to our children during the pandemic, because the pandemic, the germ cells, did not close the doors of the school. We did that. Randy Weingartner did that. Randy Weingarten, not Weingartner, I don't think. She heads the AFT, which is the largest teachers union in the U.S. and the most dangerous organization to the American child, probably, besides Planned Parenthood, probably in history. Because they actively worked against children when it came to the pandemic, because teachers unions are on the side of teachers. They do not care about students. Utterly ridiculous, I know, and crazy to even say, but here we are. Anyway, I digress. Latest data from the National Association of Educational Progress further affirms the profound impact the pandemic had on students learning in subjects beyond math and reading. Sure. It tells us that now is not the time for politicians to try to extract double-digit cuts to education funding, nor is it the time to limit what students learn in U.S. histories and civics classes. Of course, this is what a member of the Biden administration had to say about this, because you want to talk political? That's getting political on the backs of American children who were already suffering because of what your administration did during the pandemic. And let's look at what funding does for American students in Baltimore. And I know my mic is going to pop up if I don't hold on to it, but here we go. Baltimore education funding failure. Let's see where that leads us. Baltimore's failing school system is making school choice the only hope for students, education activist says. 100% correct. It is true that 23 Baltimore schools had no students proficient in math. But there's more to the story. Oh, the rest of the story is that Baltimore also spends $23,000 per student per year. And this is the result. This is the result. Seriously, incredibly embarrassing. Incredibly embarrassing. And they have to, if they have any soul at all, they should feel incredibly guilty. Oh, let's see about how much they pay per student per year, because it's the same in the largest LA district, right? Baltimore City Schools budget balloons to $21,000 per student this year. And this was 2022, the year during which 23 schools had a 0% proficiency rate when it came to, I think, math and reading. So I'm just going to contradict Miguel Cardona 100% here, because we know he's political. He's out to get he's out to get Florida, and he's out to push more educational funding. We know that dumping more money into this issue is not actually going to solve the problem. Just look at Baltimore. Seriously, I really don't see any other way around that. I'm going to close with this story. It's a little bit controversial, and I hate to jump onto this stuff a little bit early. But I wanted to kind of put this on your radar because it is a really interesting instance. But let's see what you guys are saying. Lori says, if when you and Andy have children, do you plan to homeschool? When I met Andrew Clayman, the Daily Wire's oldest and most dignified contributor, whom you guys might not even be familiar with, but one of my favorites, he said that he felt like he hadn't succeeded at much in life, but he had, in that he had kept his children from ever setting foot in a public school. My parents did the same for me and my 5 siblings. None of us ever set foot in a public school, and we are 100% better human beings for it. None of us were indoctrinated with CRT. None of us were bullied. None of us were molested. None of us faced any of that ridiculous nonsense. Sure, we had our issues. Every family has its own different issues, and that's fine. That's something you need to take into account. But yes, to answer your question, Andy and I are fully planning to homeschool our kids if and when we do have them. I will say when at this point, but I think that that's something super, super important, because it's long been a bugaboo of mine that American parents are willing to pop kids out and feed them formula, first of all, off the bat. Not even try to naturally nourish them, but they feed them formula, they feed them processed foods. I know I sound very, very crunchy, but looking at all of the information coming in about nutrition and its effect on focus, they think that red dye, red 40, that's found in tons of different candies and lots of different sodas, and I think also macaroni and cheese and stuff like that, has horrible effects on the study, on the focused factors of students, like young students right out of the gate. This has negative effects on their ability to focus. And I just have to stop and say, you can't just feed your kids kid food. You can't feed them crap. You can't just feed them nothing but chicken nuggets and Kool-Aid, okay? Even if that's what they want, right? That should not be what you're feeding your kids. The other thing, too, that American parents like to do is put their kids immediately into daycare. You can put your kids into daycare when they're newborns. Then you put them into kindergarten, you put them into preschool from a very, very, very young age. Your kid is under the control of the actual state from the age possibly of newborn, like literally birth, because mom immediately has to go back to work because everything's very expensive. And Americans have this understanding that they have to have the new car, they have to have the nice house, they have to have the big screen TV, they have to have all of this fancy stuff. And that means that both parents need to work. That means kids' needs have to come second. And that means kid is going to be under the control of the state 8 hours, 10 hours a day, every single weekday. And when they're not under the control of the state, they are under the watchful eye of the iPad and of YouTube and of Disney. And I don't know if you guys have noticed this too, but those companies aren't exactly in favor of freedom either. So American parents have these babies that they immediately feed soy formula, Red 40 and everything, seed oil. I don't know enough about seed oil, but it doesn't seem positive because you can look at the differences in diet between America and Europe and see a huge difference in quality of life, like obesity rates. Wild. It's wild. People talk constantly about going over to Europe and immediately losing weight, eat like carbs and pasta. And it just falls off because their food is so much less affected by whatever it is that we're putting into our food here. But I digress. So you have the formula, bad food, and then you immediately hand them over to the state, and then you also get them super involved in all of this technology. I have a huge issue with that. That's why I think that you need to be paying very close attention to everything that goes into your kid. And Andy is even more adamant about this than I am. Andy wants to get rid of our plastic cups. And I'm just like, babe, just don't leave the cups in the sunlight, because he's saying that it's having an effect on like little floaters in the cups. And I'm just like, look, it's cheap. It's what we have for now. We'll switch it up to metal and glass and other stuff moving forward. But I was like, that's a little bit too much for me. But at the same time, I completely understand because we don't know. Like, it's so interesting. I keep seeing memes about this. People are like, it's really kind of disheartening to see, oh yeah, that thing you've been eating and really enjoying since you were like 3 years old. Yeah, that's proven to cause 50 different types of cancer. And now we know, and you should probably stop eating it. And you're like, well, great. I've been eating that my whole life. I feel like that's kind of where we're at as Americans. And it's kind of a tough row to hoe because what are you supposed to do? You can't go back in time and make sure that doesn't happen to you. But what you can do is try and prevent that from happening to your kids. Whisper, have a great evening. Bye. I'll catch you all tomorrow. Have a nice evening for sure. USDA needs to kick rocks. All of the government oversight as far as food goes needs to kick rocks because they started to take animal fats out of everything and they started to put sugar in its place. They also subsidized corn. Oh my gosh, I could go on. They subsidized corn, which is part of the reason that corn syrup is in everything, which makes it really, really bad, really high in sugar, really bad for insulin levels, and no one seems to care about that stuff. And if you're trying to eat healthy in the US, it's incredibly difficult in ways that people who say, just hit the gym, don't seem to understand. It's in everything. And when you throw seed oils into the mix, you know what? Forget about it. Like, people who are in favor of like eliminating seed oils, I think are on a bit of a fool's errand because they are in everything, and that means there's almost nothing you can eat. St. Miles says, I tossed all my plastic and went glass. Good idea. A little bit concerned if and when we do have kids that having glass stuff is going to mean broken cups constantly. So maybe metal for the kids, but then you can't microwave that. It's kind of complicated. I'm sure we'll figure it out. Not too worried about it. Some rando says there's a feedback mechanism with breast milk. Skin-to-skin contact between mother and baby changes the content of the breast milk. Yes, I'm sure there is. There's so much we don't understand about stuff like breastfeeding. Like, the fact of the matter is that skin-to-skin contact between mother and child is essential. Turning your child over to a daycare immediately is probably the worst thing you can do for them. You're losing skin to skin. You're losing actual breast milk. You are increasing your own personal chances of getting breast cancer because breastfeeding actually reduces the chances of that particular cancer. I know how it is. Some mothers can't do it. If you can, I feel like this is certainly something that each mother should attempt, at least for sure. Two Ladies Midwest Adventure says high fructose corn syrup is insane. Yes, that and seed oils in everything. It's crazy. Yeah, and you're 100% correct about breastfeeding. Two Ladies says use real glass, metal bad. LOL, I researched this. Possibly so, but I'm not going to give my 2-year-old glasses. I'm sorry. That just sounds like a way to get their feet cut and to cause serious cuts. Two Ladies says I love Andy for sure. Our best, your hubby. So Miranda says the word Slav came from the medieval Latin Slavus, which literally translates as slave. There is an entire ethnicity literally named slave, and it's a group of Europeans. I think that's correct. I thought it was the other way around. I thought the English word for slave came from a Slav. Could go either way. I should look it up for sure. But yes, you are correct. So many Slavs were enslaved that the words became inextricably linked. Keenan says most of Florida gets paid by the government retirement state. Apparently, I saw an article earlier today about how retirees are fleeing the state, probably because of Ron DeSantis. And I thought to myself, that's probably a good thing, because I know that retirees are purchasing stuff, but as the economy gets worse and their pensions dry up or whatever savings they had dry up, it's going to be more and more important for Florida to have people who are actively working and contributing to their economy. So we'll see what happens there. Could have been nothing. People really don't like DeSantis, so it might have been an article against him. Keenan says crystal batteries are real. I have never heard of that. I'm going to have to look that up. He says Cuba doesn't control your actions. They control your choices. That's correct, too. I'm curious about a lawsuit that took place if a child runs away to Washington State for a sex change surgery. It is the same in California. They are sworn not to tell parents if their child goes to their state for a gender reassignment surgery. And I saw that Oregon is considering the same thing. Not sure about the lawsuit that could take place. Oh, yeah, I see. I'm curious about a lawsuit that could happen if this happens to a kid. You might not have a leg to stand on if it's the law of the state, but we'll see. Oh, goodness gracious. I feel like I've talked a lot. I've been summoned once you said in California, says Josie. Yes, thank you for your feedback. California is such a beautiful state, so horribly managed. I feel truly bad for the people who live there. But we also know that, as always, I feel like the blue comes from the big cities at the end of the day. There's really no way around it. Zero emissions, no more breathing in car exhaust. Woohoo, says Zach. Zach likes to be a little contrarian, and I do respect that. Ian always used to talk about the brake dust that would get into people's lungs from these cars, and I'll admit that there are issues with the way people get around. I would love to see better infrastructure when it comes to stuff like subways and buses and ways that people could ride together and try to make the most of our gas instead of having our individual cars. We'll see what happens. Electric vehicles, I don't think, are the way forward, because even though that's not right in your face with the exhaust fumes, we still are creating electricity with coal power. So it doesn't really save the issue. Ekim says, if the kids die from gas, who will New York and California transition? That's a great question too. Although I have to add, they shouldn't be thinking about the kids at all since they love Planned Parenthood so much. Two Ladies says to be back shortly. Oh, right. We mentioned that earlier. All right, cool. I think we're all caught up there. I got to look into that, says St. Miles for sure. Now, I don't know about wood cups, maybe a viable option. I have to think about it. There has to be some way to get a cup that won't hurt a kid. I'm sure there are plenty of crunchy moms out there who are requesting just such a thing. Well, I ranted a lot longer about the American diet and about whether we would homeschool our kids than I thought we would, so we are near the end of our time together for this evening. But tomorrow, there might be more of a development on this particular story. In fact, let me show you the headline I was going to touch on, but there is a lot that needs to be said here, so maybe it's best if we wait until tomorrow anyway. Shocking video shows New York City subway passenger putting unhinged man in deadly chokehold. That's right. The man who came onto the subway and who was yelling and screaming and intimidating fellow passengers was put into a submission hold by a young white blonde Marine male. And now Alvin Bragg is after this young man. So we will see what happens. I don't see him getting a fair trial. Let's put it that way. But he does deserve a fair trial because I believe firmly that he made the right choice. But we'll read some of those details tomorrow, and it's possible more news will come out about that particular case in the intervening time. You guys, I'm about to go over and upload this podcast, whatever this is, this show to Rumble. It's going to go up on podcast platforms, specifically Spotify and a bunch of other different ones. Not sure about Apple Podcasts. Apple makes it incredibly difficult to search the podcasts. Adrian says this poor Marine. I completely agree. I'm entirely on the same page. Now, the New York Daily News was saying that trouble was brewing over this. Like, people were really upset about this because it feels so racist to them. I don't think that's going to have the effect they think it will, because just saying, the left were the ones calling for community policing. And I don't know what you would call this if it's not community policing. This is a member of the community taking steps to protect other members of the community. But for some reason, the left doesn't like this either. But they're just trying to make it into a racial thing. And I don't think it is. I think the effect would have been exactly the same if it had been a white vagrant, someone who is coming onto the subway and yelling and screaming and causing all sorts of trouble and putting people into danger as well. But of course, we'll never know because the media does not cover stories like that with the same tenacity that they covered this kind of story, because they know this is how they get their clicks, likes, shares, etc. St. Miles says they just don't want people to protect themselves. I'm inclined to agree. And there is a sentiment on the right that this is exactly what would happen. And I actually saw a tweet about this earlier today that Matt Walsh retweeted that I thought was really interesting. It was a lady who was saying that they want you to feel exposed and vulnerable, incapable of defending yourself. This is exactly how they keep control over you. And I am inclined to agree that she is entirely correct. I think this is exactly what they want. But I digress. We'll save that for tomorrow. Goodbye, Lori. We'll see you tomorrow. I'm about to upload this stuff to Rumble. Go over to Timcast IRL and watch them talk about Ukraine possibly trying to assassinate Putin. Until next time, I will see you all later. Until then, bye, guys.
How's it going?